The Airspeed Company was formed in 1931 by Alfred Hessel Tiltman and Neville Shute Norway. Tiltman and Norway had both held senior positions in the Airship Guarantee Company, builders of the R100, but Britain's airship programme ended in October 1930 after the fatal loss of the R101. Sir Alan Cobham joined Airspeed as a director, and Amy Johnson was an early shareholder. Unusually, Airspeed's first design was a high-performance sailplane. This was for entirely practical reasons, being quick to produce, and it soon captured several records, thus enabling the company to raise more capital. Sir Alan Cobham commissioned Airspeed's first powered design, a biplane capable of carrying several passengers for air experience flights. Designed by Hessel Tiltman, it could carry 10 passengers out of a small field and fly safely on 2 engines. Completed in the York bus garage that served as the factory, the ferry, as it was christened, was towed, outer wing panels removed, to nearby Sherburn in Elmet for test flying. In those days of little traffic, it was somewhat unfortunate to meet the rudder of the Berengaria travelling in the opposite direction, but the 2 unusual convoys managed to pass. As an aeroplane, the ferry was successful, but as a design it was a prehistoric dead end. In total, 4 were built. However, if the ferry was a throwback to the Jurassic era, then its successor, the Courier, was a wonder of the modern age. A low-wing 6-seat monoplane powered by an Armstrong-Siddeley Lynx engine, it was the first British production airplane to include retractable undercarriage. During construction, Airspeed moved from the old bus garage in York to a purpose-built factory on the new aerodrome at Portsmouth in Hampshire. On the 10th of April 1933, the prototype Courier took off on its maiden flight, piloted by Flight Lieutenant George Stainforth of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Initially flown without the drag-reducing town end ring around the engine, the prototype nonetheless achieved performance close to its design estimate. With the town end ring fitted, certification was completed at RF Martlesham Heath by June 1933. Production started immediately, and production machines had the option of the slightly larger Armstrong-Siddeley Cheetah engine for improved hot and high performance, and in December 1933, Lord Ronaldsay, assisted by Mr. Kelly, flew the first production machine to India and back on a sales tour. As a director of Airspeed, Sir Alan Cobham had first become aware of the Courier when it was just a doodle on Hessel Tiltman's drawing board. Indeed, the prototype had been commissioned by Cobham for eventual use on a non-stop flight from England to Australia. By 1934, plans were well advanced. Cobham was assisted by squadron leader William Helmore, with whom he would share the flying. Tanking was provided by 2 adapted Handy-Page airliners bought from Imperial Airways in 1932. During refuelling, Helmore, dressed in high-speed tweed and with strict instructions not to drop the filler cap, had to catch a shot line dropped from the aircraft above. In early trials, the shot line weight dropped neatly into the aileron well, briefly jamming the controls. Later shot lines used a child's balloon partially filled with water. Test flying and practice refuelling continued throughout the summer of 1934, but by September, Sir Alan was ready to attempt a non-stop flight from England to India. They set off on the 22nd. The first refuelling rendezvous, over the south coast of England, went without a hitch, as did the second over Malta in the Mediterranean. However, shortly after leaving Malta, heading east, the throttle linkage became detached. The engine ran to full power. Cobham headed back towards Malta and switched the engine off. They glided into Halfar Aerodrome. Damage was minimal because on the Courier, much like the contemporary DC-3, part of the wheel protruded from the bottom of the wing, even when the undercarriage was retracted. Sadly, the flight was overshadowed by the loss of the first tanker later that same day. Heading north to Coventry, after removal of the fuel tanks at Ford Aerodrome, the tailplane failed and it crashed near Aston Clinton in Buckinghamshire, killing all 4 on board. Cobham abandoned plans for an England-Australia flight, although his flight refuelling ambitions ultimately proved very successful. Courier production continued, with several entering airline service. One was lost when it hit high ground in Kent, killing all 4 on board and injuring 2 on the ground. This machine hit a floodlight at Lymm. The pilot was slightly injured, but the aircraft was repaired, as seen here. In October 1934, Australian squadron leader Stoddart, assisted by his English cousin Sergeant Pilot Stoddart, entered an Airspeed Courier in the McRobertson Air Race from Mildenhall to Melbourne. They arrived in 6th place, having taken 9 days and 18 hours to reach Melbourne. Sergeant Stoddart flew the last leg, his cousin beside him, heavily bandaged, having walked into a rotating propeller. The Air Ministry bought a Courier for the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. It was far more modern than the biplane fighters of the time and was in service at least 2 years before the Hawker Hurricane even flew. The Air Ministry Courier was later modified with trailing edge flaps, the only Courier to be so fitted. The snappily named Portsmouth, Southsea and Isle of Wight Aviation Company ran a fleet of Couriers from Portsmouth. These two were modified, with fixed undercarriage carrying streamlined fairings, more suitable to their short sector operation. The Napier Rapier, a 16-cylinder H configuration engine, had first flown in 1929. In June 1934, the Napier Company bought an Airspeed Courier as a flying testbed for the Napier Rapier Mark IV. It continued in this role until 1937, when it was fitted with a Cheetah radial engine and sold. In June 1934, a twin-engined Airspeed, the Airspeed Envoy, had flown as a prototype and by 1936 was in full production. A single Envoy and 4 Couriers had been bought by the Union Founders Trust, a gun-running organisation sympathetic to the Spanish Republicans. Their export blocked by the British government, on the 20th of August 1936, 2 Airspeed employees, Republican sympathisers, decided to take matters into their own hands. Neither could fly, the outcome being inevitable. The younger man, Gargett, subsequently died of his injuries, and his accomplice, Smith, only received an 8-month prison sentence. In total, 16 Airspeed Couriers were built, and by September 1939, the 9 that remained in service were impressed into the military. Inevitably, that number declined, although several machines made their way back to Airspeed for overhaul. In the summer of 1941, a mechanic at Airspeeds in Portsmouth took a Courier on an unauthorised flight. The mechanic, Lionel Jackson, was in dispute with the aircraft inspector. The inspector said the aircraft was not airworthy. Jackson, who'd been working on the aircraft, said it was, and to prove a point, he flew it. Jackson was fined £5, but unlike the pair who'd stolen the aircraft in 1936, at least he was a qualified pilot. The incident did him no harm at all. In 1943, he and his Clark Gable moustache were both commissioned into the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, completing their flying training at Medicine Hat in Alberta. Jackson survived the war, living to the grand age of 96. The only Courier to survive the war was overhauled at Southend. It was then used for pleasure flights until December 1947, when it was withdrawn. It was later burned. Thank you for watching.